Australian cinema has evolved over time to represent changing culture and demographics. From George Miller's early Mad Max trilogy to The Castle, Red Dog, and just recently Talk to Me, we have seen this country's cinema shift significantly in the way of representing average Australian people, rather than portraying a typical true blue, outgoing larrikin agenda to satisfy outside audiences. In this video essay, I'll be unpacking two Australian movies, one being The Castle from 1997 as a representation of a relatively old Australian culture, and Talk to Me from 2022 as a modern day example. The Castle is a 1997 comedic film created by Rob Sitch. A working class family from Melbourne, Australia fights City Hall after being told they must vacate their beloved family home to allow for infrastructural expansion. It's a classic film based around the little guy, metaphorically, in the form of classic Aussie battler dad named Daryl Kerrigan, and his family sticking it to the big corporations who are trying to take their home away. It follows a lot of the classic Australian film tropes. For example, the true blue, outgoing, delusionally positive main protagonist, Daryl Kerrigan. These attributes are confirmed in the movie when he says,
"How's the serenity?"
while looking towards some power lines in a field, or just the entirety of the opening scene. Kerrigan's core values encompass his family-first attitude, but also standing up for himself when he needs to. We see these tropes portrayed throughout the film and in lots of other Australian movies as well, including Crackerjack, Muriel's Wedding, or Red Dog. So it's not something specific to this movie, it's an Australian cinema thing as a whole. Like a lot of these movies, The Castle is also traditional in the way it represents Australian cultures, as most of the characters, if not all of them, are Caucasian. There are only a few mentions or depictions of other cultures, one of them being the big Greek wedding for Tracy and Con, and when Tracy and Con come back from holiday in Thailand. Although The Castle does have a limited representation of multiculturalism for today's standards, it was very much the norm for its own time period, which was also suggested by this excerpt from A Companion to Australian Cinema. Part 1 closes with an incisive critique by emerging scholars Odette Collada and Maddie Clark of the uninterrupted whiteness of Australian screen culture. Contrasting to The Castle, Talk to Me is a 2022 horror film by Danny and Michael Philippou. A group of friends discover how to conjure spirits using an embalmed hand. They become hooked until one of them goes too far and unleashes terrifying supernatural forces. It's a modern take on Australian films like we've never seen before. Straight off the bat, the opening scene is a house party with a bunch of young teens and rap music in the background. This immediately sets the tone that this is a modern Australia, and it couldn't possibly be anything else. The use of social media is also prevalent in the film, and given that the directors were heavily involved in that environment prior to the making of this movie, it makes sense that the integration was near perfect. This is not a thing you regularly see in Australian cinema, especially if it follows a traditional layout. Most of all, this movie is a brilliant representation of just everyday Australian suburbia. A lot of previous cinema from this country doesn't focus enough on what most Australians actually experience it as. There's a lot of focus on outback or rural settings, just because that's what we as a country are known for. But Talk to Me breaks that mould. People are tired of seeing the same old rhetoric in Australian cinema, especially internationally. They've been drip-fed the larrikin Aussie agenda, and that shows, as Talk to Me, an authentic Aussie film, was one of the most successful Australian national films internationally, grossing $92 million worldwide. Films whose greatest critical interest is in their nationalness, Verhoeven urges attention away from a narrow or regressive focus on the national to the fluidity of cultural invention. Movies can say a lot about what people are feeling during a certain time period. Take all the European film movements, for example. Italian neo-realism, sparked from resentment of Mussolini's propaganda films and the tragedy of World War II. Or French New Wave, based on rebellion against traditional French cinema. I believe that The Castle and Talk to Me are both good representations of what Australian people are feeling right now and have felt like in the past. The Castle was created in the 90s, in the midst of a fairly good time for Australia. There was the grunge movement, but more importantly, something like the Mabo decision, which happened in 1992, could have really inspired the whole concept of this film. The Mabo decision happened to recognise the existence of native title and that Indigenous Australians held traditional rights to land. This really ties into the castle's main theme of fighting for your own land, and even is acknowledged within the film.
I'm really starting to understand how the Aborigines feel.
On the other hand, Talk to Me, as a more modern film, could have really been sparked by current and more recent events such as COVID, war, and politics. Recently, there has been an overarching sense of angst about world catastrophe, mostly within the media. I don't think that there's a coincidence that horror as a film genre is on the rise in Australia too, especially with things like the cost of living crisis. I think that the once happy Australian attitude has now flipped into a general fear for the future. At the end of the day, horror is a genre based on fear. A film critic by the name of Mitch Bezzetto tends to agree. Well, I think it's fair to say it isn't just rising, it's baring its teeth, drawing blood, and charging forward with a vengeance. A bold new wave of filmmakers are taking the best of the past, flipping on its head, and turning it into something loud, proud, and fashionably new. Australian film has come a long way from the traditional, full of stereotypical trope movies like The Castle, which remind us of our own past, like looking at old photos through a nostalgic lens, to the modern new wave of Australian films that truly represent our country currently and authentically, like Talk to Me. You may ask the question, is Australian cinema changing for the better? Well, that's up to interpretation, but it sure has become more real.